From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
My name is Mary Lou Rieker, and on behalf of the Kluge Center and the Office of Scholarly Programs of the Library of Congress, I want to welcome you to a talk today by Dr. Toure F entitled, "We Must Learn to Think in Terms of Collective Action, Industrial Democracy and the Civil Rights Establishment of the 1930s. Before I begin, I want to remind you to turn off your cell phones, and also to remind you that Dr. Reed is the holder of a Kluge Fellowship made possible through the generosity of the late Mr. John W. Kluge. Dr. Toure F received 2 master's degrees and his Ph.D. in history from Columbia University. He subsequently turned his thesis into a book entitled Not Alms, but Opportunity, The Urban League and the Politics of Racial Uplift, 1910 to 1950, which was published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2008. And he co-authored the book, Renewing Black Intellectual History, The Ideological and Material Foundations of African American Thought, which was released by Paradigm Publishers in 2009. Since he began his work at the Kluge Center, he has also been asked to contribute a chapter on African American activism and public policy to an upcoming Oxford University Press volume entitled The Depression and the New Deal, Historical and Historiographic Meanings. In addition to these books, Toure has published articles and reviews and spoken widely on 20th century African American history. Since 2001, he has been teaching at the Illinois State University, where he is an associate professor of U.S. and African American history, and has received a number of awards as an outstanding teacher. His work at the Kluge Center, which you will hear more about now, has been focused on a monograph project concerning the influence of labor activism on the agendas of the 2 most important U.S. civil rights organizations of the 1930s and 40s, the NAACP and the National Urban League. Please help me welcome him today, Dr. Toure F. Where is he?
Good afternoon. Thank you all for attending the talk. Before I move ahead, I'd like to give special thanks to Carolyn and Mary Lou. I feel a bit like the Kluge recluse. Every morning, I come in at 8:35 when the building opens. I go to my desk, I drink a Diet Coke, have a protein bar, take a migraine strength Excedrin for additional caffeine, check my email, and head over to the Madison building by 9 a.m., where I spend most of my day taking digital images of documents in the NAACP papers until I run out of batteries. I say this in relation to my thanks to Carolyn and Mary Lou, ultimately because in my time here, I've been here 5 months now, I have collected about 12,000 images, 12,000 pages in the NAACP papers, and there's no way I could have done this without the support of the Kluge. So thank you very much. There's, again, no way I could continue work on my next project were it not for the support provided here. I'd also like to thank the friends that I've made here, as well as the staff at the Kluge Center, and my cousin, who I haven't seen in a couple of years, who's taking time out of her busy day to come see her flaky cousin. Moving ahead, today's talk, we must learn to think in terms of collective action, as Mary Lou was kind enough to mention, offers a very narrow window onto what will eventually be my second book. That second book-length project, again, will focus on the NAACP, the NUL, and the National Negro Congress during the 1930s and 40s. as a window onto the impact of New Deal labor activism on black civil rights politics. I've chosen those groups, again, as a window onto the impact of industrial democracy on civil rights in the 30s and 40s for a couple of different reasons. One is that two of the three groups are two of the most influential and important civil rights groups in the nation's history. The second reason is that these three groups are pretty distinct. For the sake of brevity, it probably doesn't make any sense to get into what distinguishes the NNC from the NUL or the NAACP, so I'll plow ahead by just saying a little something about the NAACP and NUL and what distinguishes, allegedly, those two groups. Most people in this room, I think, understand the NAACP to be the oldest and most significant civil rights organization. I'm sure everyone knows the NAACP was founded in 1909. I'm sure as well that everyone appreciates the fact that the impetus behind the founding of the NAACP was to respond to the nullification, essentially, of the 14th and 15th Amendments and the inhumane and maybe more importantly undemocratic treatment that black Americans experienced in the aftermath of that nullification. Things such as lynching, debt peonage, disfranchisement, and of course, de jure segregation were all at the forefront of the NAACP's agenda. Evils such as that, I should probably say, right? The NAACP, of course, attempts to challenge those three, or those several evils, as I will call them, via education, occasional boycotts, and of course, most famously, through court challenges. The National Urban League and the NAACP are both integrationist organizations. The National Urban League, however, pursues racial equality via a different strategy. It's a social work organization. It was founded in 1910, just a year after the NAACP, in response to what would eventually become the Great Migration. The Great Migration refers to, of course, the exodus of blacks from the rural South to cities across America, but in this context, principally the North, eventually southern cities, though, will be applicable. The Urban League's approach to dealing with the problems associated with migration were quite distinct from the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People's approach to dealing with the problems confronting blacks. Since the Urban League is a social work group, it set out to assist blacks in adjusting to industrial cities. These are rural people who are, again, moving from rural communities to cities, right? And not just any old city, industrial cities, right? Cities very different from most cities in America today. To that extent, the Urban League then assisted black newcomers to these cities by working directly with landlords and employers, white landlords and white employers principally, to encourage landlords and employers to open access to housing and employment to black Americans who faced a great deal of discrimination. I still have a third baseman or shortstop's hands. My watch just fell and I caught it. Anyway, can't keep a good shortstop down. All right, so anyway, again, it worked directly with landlords and employers to encourage them to increase access to jobs and housing, not in that order. It likewise, though, worked to assist black migrants in acculturating to cities, right, to urban life. Again, these are rural people who are accustomed to hard work, absolutely, but not necessarily the dictates of industrial employment, the routinized dictates of industrial employment. To that extent, to that end, again, assisting black migrants in acculturating to industrial cities, the Urban League embraced a kind of assimilationist model, not just an integrationist model, but its approach to integration pivoted partly off of the acculturation of blacks to industrial cities. And to achieve that end, the Urban League embraced models of assimilation associated with the famed Chicago School of Sociology, which I'll elaborate on in a bit, but I just want to put that out there. Like the NAACP, the NUL's overarching aim again was integration and of course equality. As you've seen from the sketch, hopefully, or heard from the sketch that I've laid out, however, the two groups seek integration through very different means, right? The Urban League's approach relied very heavily, at least in the years before the New Deal, on voluntarism, on the goodwill, on the largesse, incurring the goodwill of employers and landlords, as opposed to a more confrontational approach that we might associate, at least in this context, with the NAACP. Now, this gets us to the distinctions between the two groups then, right? Generally speaking, even though the NAACP and Urban League have quite a bit in common, they're progressive era organizations, they're integrationist organizations, they even have overlapping membership. Generally, the two groups are seen as being very different, right? The NAACP is generally seen as part of a kind of bourgeois militant civil rights establishment, right? That is, again, much more confrontational, hence the use of the term militant, and is often associated with W.B. Du Bois, right? So the NAACP is again considered to be a kind of bourgeois militant organization, the intellectual offspring of W.B. Du Bois. The NUL, by contrast, is seen as a more conservative organization with its emphasis on voluntarism, and self-help, and is often, again, cast in the vein of Booker T. Washington, right, the great accommodationist. This is a pretty commonsensical worldview, and in fact, as I often point to, my introduction to the Urban League as a child was through pop culture and came at the hands of, hold on, I've never used PowerPoint before, came at the hands of this guy, Fred G. Sanford. I don't know if any of you have watched Sanford and Son. It's a great, great show. But I had first become aware of the Urban League when I was about 5 years old, thanks to Sanford and Son. I won't bore you with the details of the episode that's relevant, but you can ask in the Q&A. Ask in the Q&A, and we'll talk Sanford and Son. And I'll talk Sanford and Son until 6 p.m. I know every episode is Sanford and Son, so we can have fun with that. But anyway, I won't bore you with the details, but the gist of it was in this exchange that Fred G. Sanford, Red Fox, has with someone, was this notion, again, that the Urban League was a very conservative organization that didn't represent the desires of, the masses of black people, right? That was the popular perception. I'm not saying that's the case, but that's the popular perception. The above formulation, I should say very clearly, is a perspective that I don't embrace. So the distinctiveness that I just laid out between the NAACP and the Urban League is not one that I fully embrace. Again, that distinctiveness presumes that the Urban League and the NAACP represent two distinct strains of black politics. And I don't think they do represent two distinct strains of black politics. To the contrary, I would argue that the Urban League and the NAACP are part of the same liberal progressive moment. They represent different ends of the continuum, to be sure, of that liberal progressive moment. But they're both, again, integrationist organizations. They both proceed from the view that blacks should be part of the mainstream in civil society. The difference is one of method, not aim, and even, again, not fully ideology. The notion, again, that the Urban League is fully distinct from the NUL, from the NAACP, pivots, again, partly off this assumption that the Urban League owes its lineage to Booker T. Washington. What I've argued elsewhere, and I'll make the case again today, is that the Urban League's intellectual lineage stems not from Washington, but from the famed Chicago School of Sociology, very modern approach to assimilation, acculturation, and it's actually quite in step with W.B. Du Bois's philosophy. If you've ever read The Philadelphia Negro, it presages what the Chicago School will end up doing, right? And again, I do intend to elaborate on what I mean by the Chicago School. All right, so the Urban League and the NAACP are part of the same moment. They both, again, represent a liberal progressive view on civil rights, but they pursue different tactics. And that is an important distinction, but they're not cut from different cloth altogether anyway. During the New Deal will impact these two groups, and both organizations would begin to shift focus to fairly significant extent, well, to varying degrees. Both organizations would begin to pay heed to class issues during the New Deal, right? And they would do so, again, to varying degrees. During the New Deal and World War II, between the 30s and 40s, class issues will move to the forefront of the agendas of the two organizations at different times, to different degrees. This gets me to one of the reasons that I essentially reject the notion that the Urban League is a conservative organization. There's a fascinating twist here. The Urban League will actually embrace class politics in an institutional way, ahead of the NAACP. which is part of what I'm going to talk about today when I get to the meat of the talk. Okay. Now, the embrace of class politics, of labor politics as a civil rights strategy during the New Deal and World War II makes a lot of sense that these two groups would do so, partly for opportunistic reasons alone. Labor law provides opportunities for mass protest that did not exist. The Norris-LaGuardia Act of 1932, Section 7A of the NIRA in 1933, the National Labor Relations Act, which I will probably henceforth refer to as the Wagner Act, all signal to working people that they can organize, they can mobilize, they can protest, they will be provided protections by the federal government to take direct action. And they likewise signal, I guess I should amplify this, again, to working people that they can protest and challenge power. From that perspective, from an opportunistic perspective alone, it makes sense that civil rights groups would begin to embrace a kind of class politics, because this is the legitimate politics of the 1930s and 1940s. The embrace, again, the Urban League and NAACP's embrace of class politics is not reducible, I should say, to opportunism. There's also a political, cultural shift that takes place, and this is where we get to industrial democracy. Ultimately, what happens in the 1930s, again, thanks in part to New Deal labor legislation, is that New Dealers institutionalize a form of Republican government that sought to restrain inequities associated with industrial capital by empowering the citizenry, right? Again, through the National Industrial Recovery Act, through the Wagner Act, liberals in Washington attempted to equip workers with the tools necessary to advance their interests. Myriad relief programs, the Social Security Act of 1935, the Fair Labor Standards Act, likewise afforded a broad cross-section of Americans a modicum of economic stability and even personal dignity. This gets us to industrial democracy, right? The New Dealers modernize democracy on some level. They inject democracy, something that I think most of us today think of as a procedural thing. Lonnie and I were talking about procedural democracy, or democracy as simply being procedural before the talk. The New Dealers inject a sense of democracy into the workplace. And it's a very different moment than the moment in which we live, right? The NUL and NAACP, in the context of the 30s, have to grapple with the changes that are taking place around them. Not just on general principle, not for abstract ideological or even opportunistic purposes, but because black people are hurting to even a much greater extent than whites during the New Deal. This is not news to anyone, I'm sure. But during the New Deal, as we know, during the Great Depression, rather, unemployment was unbelievably high, right? Overall unemployment, I believe, in 1933 was about 25%, according to conservative estimates. Underemployment, I believe, was about 50% or so. For blacks, unemployment often more than doubled that, right? For blacks in cities such as Chicago and New York, unemployment ranged from between 40 and 55% in this era. And interestingly enough, unemployment for black women was notably higher than unemployment for black men. The reverse was true for whites. Unemployment for white men was higher than it was for white women, right? The high rates of unemployment that blacks experience in these industrial cities that have essentially collapsed cause social decay, which again galvanizes civil rights organizations to take action. Likewise, it causes political insurgency. Communists attempt to co-opt, as urban leaguers and NAACP members saw it anyway, the unease, the restlessness among unemployed Afro-Americans, and to bring them into the fold, right? These forces galvanize the NAACP and the NUL to try to reassess their missions and to broaden their scope beyond simple integration, but to wed integration with class, social, with economic justice, right? Now I'll move on to the groups. So the NAACP is the one I will begin with, and before I go there, let me just say this from the outset. I'm only talking about the 1930s today, and what might be the bait and switch element of the talk is the short answer of what happens with the NAACP's approach to class politics in the 1930s is not much. The NAACP in the 1930s offers maybe more rhetorical nods to class politics than the NUL, which will actually institutionalize class politics. The NAACP will not really move to institutionalize working class politics until the 1940s. Nevertheless, it's important to cover this period. The NAACP, while it's slower to move on class politics than the NUL in an institutional framework, actually gets the ball rolling in 1933 via the Second Amenia Conference. And at the Second Amenia Conference in 1933, the NAACP, which is called, obviously by the NAACP and Joel Spingarn, president of the NAACP, calls this conference essentially to revitalize the organization, right, which may have lost its way. Participants, who included a range of folks, some of whom I will end up talking about today, argued that, is that feedback? Is that good? Can you hear me still? Good enough. Participants argued that race leaders had focused too narrowly on the so-called Negro question, leading them to overlook the relationship between poor working conditions thrust upon Afro-Americans and black economic and social psychological depression. Reasoning that blacks were an exploited class of laborers, conference attendants identified interracial working class alliances as essential to Afro-American uplift. And what happens is, after the Amenia Conference, the NAACP follows up the next year in the form of the Committee on the Future Plan and Program, which attempted to, again, build on the work of the Amenia Conference. That initiative was headed by black economist Abram L. Harris, who had also been an NUL staffer. The committee encouraged the NAACP to change its focus. It encouraged the NAACP to transform itself into a center of workers' education and agitation. What would later be known as the Harris Report urged the association to develop courses intended to educate workers about their place, black workers, about their place in industry, and to likewise promote interracial working class solidarity. Harris also called upon the civil rights group to educate workers as to their rights as workers. And finally, Harris suggested that the local branches be given more authority, which was a pretty clever approach because some of the local branches were more aggressive than the National Association, right? So if you want to push the association to the left in this context, you give the locals more power, right? Naturally, the executive secretary of the NAACP, Walter White, who is featured in the middle, I often refer to Walter White as the aptly or ironically named Walter White. Walter White is in fact black, so he's the guy in the middle, right? Roy Wilkins is on the left, Walter White is in the middle, a young Thurgood Marshall is on the right. Walter White was hip to Harris's game, if you will, and ultimately shelved the Amenia Conference findings and the Harris Report. White argued that such a transformation of the association was financially unfeasible in that time period, right? The NAACP at this point is experiencing some hits, of course, in contributions, which I'll elaborate on in a bit. Likewise, White was concerned that a class focus would run afoul of the interests of some of its important benefactors. And why that's especially important in this moment is that the source of contributions in the NAACP is shifting. The NAACP had long up to this point relied disproportionately on contributions from members and likewise its branches. Philanthropists were part of this mix always, but the branches and members provided the lion's share of finances. Not true in the 1930s. It shifts towards the philanthropists. So White was especially concerned of offending important benefactors. White, though, was likewise not unaware of the need for the association to enhance its viability, and instead of, in the 1930s, pursuing the kind of agenda proposed by Harris et al., White and the association would step up their anti-lynching campaign, right, which they hoped would resonate with the masses. Having said all that, you can still see, even as the association doesn't move towards class politics in an institutional way until the 1940s, and it will in the 1940s. In the 1930s, you can see pretty clear expressions of industrial democracy in some of the League's official statements, publications, and conventions. And I'll just give you a couple of examples from the annual conventions. The first examples, of course, of class politics associated with the League you can see in Amenia and the Harris reports in 1933. Moving ahead, though, we can also see this in the 1933 annual convention, What's on the overhead is a document that I'm sure that most of you can't read, but it's an excerpt from the Resolutions Committee of the 1933 Annual Convention in Chicago. The document is entitled, the resolution focuses on the economic status of black Americans. It states pretty clearly that the economic status of blacks was a key issue that the association needed to consider. The relevant portion of the document, I think the whole document's great. I put up more than is necessary for your pleasure, but the portion of the document, if you can read it, that is relevant here is just the first couple of sentences. As the document states, again in the first couple of sentences, the paramount concern of the Negro today is his economic status. His interests in this field are inextricably interwoven with those of white workers. With them, he demands redistribution of wealth through systematic taxation of large incomes and conduct of industry and government for the benefit of the many and not of the few. The resolution goes on to state, and this is not on the overhead, it's a lengthy enough document, though. The resolution goes on to state that blacks cared not just about the franchise, lynching, and Liberia, but they were invested in capping profits of the wealthy to curb inflation that might arise from enhancing consumer purchasing power, and they cared about the integration of the labor movement as well as public works as well. A related document from the same convention, from a bulletin, the middle portion, the quote, is what's relevant here, describes what's going on as a transformation in Afro-Americans' thinking about politics. In the middle portion of that document, again, it's bracketed with quotes, is a reference to Booker T. Washington. And it states, in its day, the theory of Booker T. Washington was all right, but today there is little chance for the butcher, baker, small farmer, shoemaker, and other artisans which Washington wished to create at Tuskegee. Today, because of the growth of industry, most men are destined to be wage workers. This applies to Negroes as well as whites. Therefore, Negroes, in addition to fighting for their own battles, must fight for the security of all workers. Again, I mean, it's stating very clearly that if Afro-Americans want to advance, they must ally with people that are similarly situated. Those would be white workers, right? The juxtaposition with Booker T. Washington is also striking. I may come back to that, but I'll move forward. The transformation of black thinking will be a recurring theme. The last of the three documents that I'm going to direct your attention to, which is authored by Lester Granger, who gives a speech at the NAACP convention in 1938, likewise echoes that theme. Moving ahead, 1936 convention. 1936 annual convention dials back on the class concerns, right? In keeping with Walter White's push, again, for an anti-lynching campaign, labor issues are much less pronounced in the agenda of the 1936 annual convention. They are there, though. They're not the star of the show. Having said that, working class solidarity, the need for working class solidarity and to connect, the need for Afro-American civil rights, or for black Americans to connect civil rights to a broader cross struggle, is made plain nonetheless by some convention participants. The above document is an excerpt from a speech given by Ralph Bunche at the 1936 convention. The speech is called Fascism and Minority Groups. And Bunche describes fascism, interestingly enough, as a desperate attempt of the capitalist class to save itself in a time of economic crisis by constructing false enemies intended to distract the exploited from the true source of their misery, capitalists, right? As Bunche sees it. To counter American fascism, and this is where the excerpt on the overhead is relevant, and by the way, Bunche, I believe, was referring to the efforts of Father Coughlin and the Union Party in the 1936 efforts when he was discussing American fascism. Anyway, to counter American fascism, Bunche advocated interracial working class cooperation. When reflecting on the appropriate role of the NAACP in this struggle against American fascism, Bunche asserts, "It seems to me there is only one possibility at all, and that is the establishment of a solid, united front of all working class people throughout the country, all colors, all religion, all complexions." Again, if black Americans want to succeed, they need allies. Those allies need to be white people who are similarly situated, you know, labor unionists, essentially. 1938 convention, similar themes arise. In this case, the document that's relevant here is a speech given by Lester Granger. Lester Granger, I've already alluded to this. Lester Granger would go on to be the head of the National Urban League and was a very successful executive of the National Urban League. At this time, in 1938, he was just wrapping up his service as head of the Urban League's Workers' Bureau, which I will talk about in about 5 or 10 minutes. Lester Granger gives a speech to the NAACP Youth Council called Challenge to the Youth. And it's a really fascinating speech. He begins with a sort of standard trope. He contrasts generations. Lester Granger sees himself as part of, and he was, part of the so-called New Negro generation, the generation of black Americans who participated in the Great Migration, who had given us the Harlem Renaissance. And he compares the so-called New Negro generation with the current crop of New Deal generation, young people, the Young Turks of that era. And Lester Granger draws some similarities and some important distinctions. He argues that both groups, the New Negro generation and I'm just going to call the New Deal generation the Young Turks, embraced a kind of manly assertiveness. They believed that they had a right to equality, right? And neither expected to or was willing to bow their heads to power. But the difference between the two is what matters here, right? And for Granger, what accounts for the difference is simply this. Granger casts his generation as suffering from the naive belief that progress might come through individual action. In fact, the quote that is the title of this talk is from this speech, just to give you a window onto where Granger goes with this. But again, Granger says the New Negro generation made a huge mistake when it believed that blacks might simply advance by simply being good people, right? By embracing middle-class values, living the lives that people are expected to live, and by extension demonstrating to whites that blacks are worthy of citizenship. So no, that'll get you nowhere, right? Individualism is, as Jerry Seinfeld said about, I think it was breakfast, for suckers. But anyway, maybe it was lunch, I don't know. It was one of the two. Anyway, he goes on to say that the individual young Negro today is wasting his time when he tries to carve out for himself a little niche of personal security, disregarding what happens to his fellows, right, which is buried in this text here. From there, Granger, expanding on this point, asserts that black youth have learned, today's black youth of the 1930s, have learned the principal lessons of the new Commonwealth, the New Deal era. First, they must fight for the man at the bottom, because anyone could find him, herself, there in modern times. Second, blacks must seek alliances with others. And as he goes on to say, slowly and painfully, young people are learning the Negro's fight for freedom is not a fight of the Negro for Negro freedom, but that the Negro's fight is only a small part of a nationwide struggle, not of 10 or 12 million Negroes, but of 55 millions of Negroes and whites, the majority of the population of this country. Now, Granger was absolutely not speaking in abstractions. What he is providing a window onto is the work that the National Urban League had been doing for the previous 4 years through the organization that he headed in the National Urban League, the Workers' Bureau, which ran the Workers' Councils, which is what I will talk about now as we move on to the National Urban League. So again, while the NAACP offers lip service, kind of rhetorical embrace, if you will, of class politics, it doesn't institutionalize class politics until the early 1940s, between 1941 and 1943. Then working class politics will be a pretty clear part of the NAACP's agenda, at least for a few to several years. The Urban League, by contrast, institutionalizes class politics in the form of the Workers' Councils in 1934. The Workers' Councils run by the National Urban League that are operated by the Urban League's Workers' Bureaus were in operation for just a few years, from 1934 to 1938. They were the brainchild of the longtime head of the Urban League's Department of Industrial Relations, T. Arnold Hill, who would go on to be acting head of the National Urban League. And the council set out to promote black union affiliation by teaching blacks about the problems of workers, the objectives of labor, and the principles of industrial organization. If I haven't put you to sleep, or if I didn't put you to sleep 15 minutes ago or 20 minutes ago, that might sound familiar. It sounds an awful lot like what Abram L. Harris suggested in 1934-35 the NAACP should pursue, right, at roughly the same period. T. Arnold Hill had called for increasing the League's emphasis on unionization since the mid-1920s. So this is something that the Urban League had debated, unionization, black participation in the union movement, that the Urban League had pursued to varying degrees of success since about 1925, when T. Arnold Hill became the head of the then newly created Department of Industrial Relations of the National Urban League. The interesting thing about it, of course, is that the Urban League wouldn't institutionalize union work until the Workers' Councils, again in 1934. After centralizing the Workers' Council's activities in the form of the Workers' Bureau, the Workers' Councils take off like wildfire. After 1 year of operation, the Workers' Bureau established 42 councils in 17 states, covering about 30,000 black workers. At the end of 4 years, the National Urban League had organized 70 workers' councils in 21 states. The councils were closed down in 1938, not because the Urban League had given up on organized labor, but the Congress of Industrial Organizations took over a lot of the work. The CIO took over a lot of the work that the workers' councils did in educating blacks about the efficacy or the importance of participating in an integrated union movement. I'm going to shift gears a little bit here and transition. Likewise, I'll show you a picture of Lester Granger, since I've mentioned him. Lester Granger is the guy in the suit. It's the guy in the middle, right? The workers' councils don't come out of nowhere, right? What's striking about this, at least from my vantage point, it's really what I want to get at, is that the allegedly more conservative group, the Urban League, is the group that takes the more militant posture in the 1930s. And there's a question that arises, and that question is, what is it? Why? Why would the more conservative group take the more militant posture? Why would the more militant group be more cautious? Funding's obviously part of the story, right? And I've talked about that with respect to the NAACP, but interestingly enough, the Urban League was in a worse state financially than the NAACP was. It had always been more beholden to the largesse of large philanthropists than the NAACP. It never managed to garner the kind of popular support that the NAACP did. So in some ways it was more bound up with the concern of philanthropists than the NAACP had been, at least historically. Part of the reason that I argue that the Urban League takes a more militant posture in this time period is, and I'll try to be as quick about this as I possibly can, is ideological. As I said from the outset, I reject the notion that the Urban League is actually a conservative organization in the vein of Booker T. Washington. I don't think that's defensible, at least not fully, though I appreciate why one would make that argument. I think it is more accurate to connect the Urban League's work to the assimilationist models associated with the famed Chicago School of Sociology. There are a lot of personnel reasons that makes sense. Many of the founding fathers of the Urban League were in fact sociologists. Many of them were trained at the University of Chicago. Even if they weren't, the University of Chicago influenced their training. Those that weren't sociologists were social workers. Social work was the stepchild of sociology, right? It's the sort of practical end of sociology. And in the early 20th century, often enough, social work and sociology were bound together, right? There are clear ideological inputs, though, that shape the Urban League's embrace of unionization, and they are derived, I think, from the assimilationist models that the Urban League embraces or acquires via the Chicago School of Sociology. The Urban League, going back to the 20s, had considered, as I alluded to, interracial working class solidarity, not just black participation in the union movement. That they had considered too, essentially since its founding as a vehicle for upward mobility. And it's obvious why they would do that, right? Most black people are working class. If unions discriminate against black people, then black people will be precluded from important sources of employment. So there's a very obvious brass tacks reason to pursue an integrationist approach to unionization. It has nothing to do with highfalutin theory, but it's more than that. As trained sociologists, the Urban Leaguers embraced, again, 3 models of assimilation, only one of which I will talk about today. And the principal one is a concept called ethnic cycle theory. And ethnic cycle theory shapes the Urban League's work in housing, it shapes the Urban League's work in employment, and it will likewise play a part in the Urban League's embrace of the union movement, again, going back to the 1920s. And I will pick up with the 1920s. Actually, I should probably tell you what ethnic cycle theory is. Ethnic cycle theory refers to, and I think a lot of us embrace ethnic cycle theory, those people who are not Nazis, probably those of us who reject biological determinism, right, probably embrace ethnic cycle theory or some version of it unwittingly. Ethnic cycle theory is an alternative to eugenics, essentially. It's one of many alternatives to eugenics. And so proceeding from the view that the differences between racial groups are not hardwired as we would think of it, are not the product of nature, but are the product of nurture. Ethnic cycle theory argues that assimilation can happen between disparate groups. And looking at the lay of the land in the early 20th century, many opponents of immigration, many opponents of black migration to cities in the urban north had argued that new immigrants and blacks would never assimilate essentially because they're hardwired to be profoundly different. They're hardwired to be criminals, they're hardwired to be stupid, they're hardwired to be bad people. Ethnic cycle theory rejects that notion. And it says, and proponents of that view look at race riots and labor unrest that occurs in the late 19th century and early 20th century in American cities, and argue that it's not about hardwired differences between blacks and whites, Italians and WASPs, Jews and WASPs, et cetera, et cetera. It's about culture. Ethnic cycle theory proceeds from the view that assimilation is part of an organic process that consists of 5 steps. Those 5 steps are first contact, contact between disparate groups. That contact leads to competition. As 2 groups come together, they compete for resources and space, jobs and housing if it's a city. That competition, of course, will lead to then stage 3, conflict. People don't like to fight, usually. Conflict will then give way to what's called accommodation, stage 4, and accommodation will eventually result in assimilation, right? Urban Leaguers embrace this notion, right? And they see blacks as being in a stage in cities somewhere between conflict and accommodation, and they want to move on to assimilation, right? And they attempt to do so by engineering positive interactions between employers and black employees. And likewise between white unionists and black unionists, all the way back to the 1920s. And you can see a very early example of this in the 1920s of a report authored by sociologist and Urban League member, officer, Charles S. Johnson, who had argued in the Chicago Commission on Race Relations report, which was authored in the aftermath of the 1919 race riot in Chicago, that he insinuated that interracial contact between black and white workers in a shared work environment would eventually lead to assimilation, right? And Johnson said, quote, "Through contact and association with Negroes during working hours, white workers may come to look upon Negroes not as members of a strange group with colored skin, but as individuals with the same feelings, hopes, and disappointments as other people." Ethnic psychotheory, incidentally, is a facet of the Brown decision, too, right, through the NAACP sociological case against segregation. As we move ahead to the 1930s, so that was from the 1920s, urban leaguers, and this is part of what the workers' councils are about, seek to soothe race relations through the union movement. And this is part of the reason, I would argue, that they embrace and institutionalize unionization ahead of the NAACP. It's part of the Urban League's work, right, from the get-go, if you will, whereas the NAACP is challenging barriers, right, real barriers, legal barriers in a direct way. The Urban League is trying to change minds, right, through, again, engineering these contexts. There are a lot of examples of this. I'm apparently very short on time now. But we can see that, again, the workers' councils look at the efforts of the Congress of Industrial Organizations in the 1930s to organize black workers in the South and North, actually, as being in step with fostering harmonious race relations. I won't read quotes because I don't think I have a lot of time for that at this point. And again, this plays a big part, to cut to the chase, of why the Urban League embraces unionization, I would argue, ahead of the NAACP. I should probably jump to the conclusion. All right. In conclusion, that's nice and organic, right? There are two issues, and feel free to ask me anything about what I've just glossed over. In conclusion, there are two things that stand out to me here about this period, and ultimately a big part of why I'm interested in it. The first is something I began with, I guess, is that it seems paradoxical at face value that the putatively conservative organization would adopt the militant stance, the militant organization would take the more cautious road, right? At least in the 1930s. To me, that's indicative of painting history in sort of broad strokes, right? And that in doing so, we tend to elide the complex forces that shape the decisions of individuals, and in this case, and I think this is in some ways more important, institutions. Internal politics, external politics, we're all sort of shaped by these things, right? And coincidentally, the group that adopts the more conservative tactic, and I think there's little doubt that the Urban League adopts a more conservative tactic in general, is better situated in the 1930s to take the more militant, to adopt a more militant tactic, ironically, right? And I think that's an important point, again, because we can see very clearly how these groups are shaped by their moment and how institutional concerns shape to what extent a group is shaped by these broader shifts. The second point that stands out in my mind is probably the soft-headed point, the thing that that motivates me most of all, I suppose, as a historian. I think history is, of course, an important field, and I think it's losing significance in the minds of a lot of people. I find history to be useful, not because I care about dead people. I don't. They're dead. Unless the zombie apocalypse is upon us, as AMC apparently predicts. You know, there's no need to be concerned about dead people in the abstract, but obviously we can learn lessons, right, from the efforts of the deceased. This time period is especially interesting in this, you know, from that vantage point. When we think of the civil rights movement popularly today, I think we have a reflex to think of it as a movement that is fueled simply by moral imperatives, right? Rosa Parks was simply within this paradigm. Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery simply because she was tired after a hard day's work, right? The common sense of our moment likewise tells us that the March on Washington was simply a place where Martin Luther King gives a speech about dreaming and personal responsibility, essentially. Obviously, neither formulation is correct, right? Rosa Parks, the Montgomery bus boycott was the contrivance of institutional politics, right? Rosa Parks knew that the NAACP that she worked for wanted a figurehead, right? Wanted a focal person, and focal point, and she was happy to oblige. And God love her. I'm glad she did it. Likewise, the March on Washington was was about a lot more than personal responsibility and dreaming. As we can see, though, the activists so in our moment, we think of civil rights, again, in a kind of messianic way. We think of it as the product of individuals who have just spoken truth to power, and through magic, the world changes on some level, right? When we look at the civil rights movement through a broader historical lens, we can see the participants of the civil rights movement didn't understand the world to operate that way at all. The activists of the 1930s understood, as Lester Granger put it, that they must learn to think in terms of collective action. And while the notion that black equality would best be achieved through interracial working class solidarity would fade during the Cold War, and it would. Many activists of the high point of the civil rights movement continued to be shaped by the lessons that they learned during the New Deal and the Second World War. And in fact, just to wrap up, the principal organizers of the Montgomery bus boycott and the March on Washington were black labor organizers, E.D. Nixon, and of course, A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin. Done. So I'm happy to answer any questions about things that I've glossed over, or Sanford and Son, if you are so inclined. Yes? Oh, sure. We've got contact, and then contact lends itself to competition. And competition gives us conflict, right? And then accommodation and assimilation. Yes? Oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure that he had to. In the end, right, I mean, as you probably know, by FDR's second turn, the black vote had flipped more than 100% from Republican to Democrat, right? The workers' councils did their part to drum up support for the New Deal, though. So on some level, the NUL's efforts essentially operated as a drumbeat for FDR. Right? Carolyn.
What was it in the environment of the 1930s that led African American leaders to think that they might successfully be able to make common cause with white workers?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, right. The question is, what happens in the 1930s that leads black Americans, black civil rights activists maybe in particular, to seek common cause with organized labor? There are a lot of things that happen. Desperation's one. But in addition to desperation, political shifts within the union movement play a big part in it. The rise of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, I think, is pivotal to this story. It's one of the things I glossed over, actually. The CIO is an industrial offshoot, right? It's the industrial union offshoot of the AFL. And as an industrial union, the CIO had embraced an approach to labor organizing that was pregnant with racial liberalism for a host of reasons, right? Craft unions had barred blacks often enough constitutionally from admissions. And that partly has to do with the way that craft unions exercise control, right? Craft unions improve the economic standing of their members by regulating membership, right? Industrial unions can't do that. So the industrial unions, the CIO and the industrial unions that had been part of the AFL were more likely to be progressive on racial issues. In amplifying that point, a lot of the key CIO organizers were communists, and communists were much more likely, of course, to have an open mind on racial issues and much more likely to organize blacks. And likewise, the CIO created positions for black organizers to help bridge that divide. So shifts within the union movement itself played a big part in shaping civil rights activists' interest in organized labor beyond mere opportunism. There was an opening now created in the form of industrial unions and the racial liberalism that often, though not always, went along with that. And just to amplify that point, of course, among the principal organizers of the March on Washington in 1963 was the UAW, right, in keeping with that very issue. There was a question. Did that answer the question, Carolyn? Yes.
Yeah, I'm curious if there is any overlap or collaboration between the AML organizing purpose councils and the employee councils that emerged.
Yes. One of the ways that they overlap, though, is there's, of course, a lot of concern about the unemployed councils and communist influence, right? In keeping with ethnic cycle theory and social disorganization, reorganization, another concept that the urban leaguers embrace. Urban leaguers, and this was something I glossed over, so I really appreciate that question, along with Carolyn's for the same reason. Urban leaguers saw participation, many of them, saw participation in mainstream unions as an alternative to radical politics, radical and nationalist politics even. So some had characterized Marcus Garvey, for example, who's not a player in the period that we're talking about, but had been a player, an important player in the previous decade, as an outgrowth of social decay, right, of what they would have called social disorganization. And Leaguers saw union participation as a way to take the legitimate concerns of black workers, right, about unemployment, feelings of alienation, right, and channeling them into constructive outlets in the form of mainstream unions. So they see, again, participation in the CIO often enough as an alternative to actual left-wing politics. Yes? Yes. The question is about A.Phil Randolph, my personal hero. If I had a hero that is someone I'm not related to, or a virtuoso heavy metal guitarist, whichever, it would be A.Phil Randolph. Granger was in much communication with Randolph. Granger actually had been a participant in the March on Washington movement as a private citizen. The Urban League did not sign on to it because it was too hot an issue for the League. Granger, however, as a private citizen, was invested in it. He bowed out, I believe, in 1943, though, in response to concerns about, I think, the Detroit race riot had amplified Granger's concerns about some of the implications of the March on Washington movement of the 1940s. So yes, there were connections. Anything else? I apologize for running long. I had a feeling I was trying to do too much, but I'm very excited about the project. So, yes. Fred Sanford, if you want to know what the anecdote was. Okay. So last question is about Fred Sanford. The G stands for gonna continue with Fred Sanford. So Fred Sanford, if you were from the UK, Sanford & Son was based on or inspired by Steptoe & Son, I believe. The episode in question that mentions the Urban League, and I think it was from the first couple of seasons, pivots off of Lamont. Lamont is the son of Sanford & Son. And Lamont did not want to be a junk man all of his life. Sanford & Son, it was a junk company. So Lamont felt there were bigger and greater things for him out in the world, and he hoped to be a thespian. He pursues acting, wins the lead in Othello in a theater production. And his Desdemona is what some might refer to as a shiksa. She's a wasp. And if you don't know what either of those are, apparently wasp has fallen out of the lexicon too. Hitler's dream girl, I think, would be another way to think of what a shiksa or a wasp would be. She is from Beverly Hills, and Lamont and the shiksa rehearse Othello in her home in Beverly Hills. And her parents happen upon Lamont as he's choking Desdemona. The patriarch is outraged. Fred is a witness to this. Fred casts the patriarch, the wasp patriarch, as a bigot. And in response, the wasp patriarch says, "Sir, I'll have you know I'm a member of the Urban League." And Fred's reaction was essentially, "So?" Indicating that this did not serve as bona fides of his liberalism. And that was my introduction to the Urban League at about the age of 5, right? And a window onto the commonsensical view of the Urban League, which is not fair, actually. So if there are no more questions, thank you very much for your patience. I apologize for my poor timing, but okay. Again,
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.